Located in North Africa, the Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert in the world. Just south of the desert is the semi-arid grassland known as the Sahel, stretching approximately 5,400 kilometers across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea in the east. In essence, the Sahel is a region of striking contrasts, fragile yet resilient, barren yet vital, holding immense ecological and cultural significance while grappling with pressing environmental and social challenges. It serves as a transitional zone between the Sahara Desert to the north and the savanna or tropical regions to the south. This unique geographic positioning shaped the Sahel's ecological, cultural, and social characteristics. Though the Sahel area hosts an abundance of natural resources, it is also often considered the most at risk for the process of desertification. Desertification is the process through which fertile land becomes less arable, drier, and permanently degraded. Before discussing the real causes of this process we know much more about today, it is important to first understand the historical and colonial narratives of desertification through time, which defines social constructs around the issue that still influence land use practices today. In terms of political ecology, a narrative, such as the one that dominates the discussion of desertification, can be defined as not a simple statement of facts, but a social and political construction that can be devised and put forward by political elites, development agencies, media, or scientists. In the early 1900s, the idea that the Sahara Desert was drying was spreading rapidly. The main narrative of this decade was strongly tied to religious beliefs. With Christianity as the dominant belief to the West and in Europe at this time, their values that associated deserts with original sin affected the perception of these lands. This era of colonization created the narrative that placed a large amount of blame for the advance of desertification on the way the native peoples managed their land and resources, suggesting it was unproductive, wasteful, and destructive. The Europeans thus saw their colonization of these lands as a way of bringing science and expertise to stop desert creation. They used this emerging crisis narrative to justify their colonization of these lands. Also around this time, French colonial administrators began to blame the Tuareg nomads and their use of African farming methods such as bushfires. This way of thinking led to multiple forestry missions by French colonists who still claimed that the indigenous people and their agricultural practices were at fault. In the 1930s, largely influenced by the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains of the U.S. around the same time, the focus of theories still followed a crisis narrative that diminished the values and resource management practices of the African people. Also during this time, with population growth and a boom in the number of cattle, worries of the land's carrying capacity and of overgrazing began to rise. In the 1970s, persistent drought led experts to reason that this population pressure previously mentioned, which only grew more in the years past, is what caused Sahelian ecosystems to be vulnerable to this drought. For example, the albedo effect, first theorized in 1974 after the drought of 1972 to 1973, related drought and overpopulation in the proposal of a global process model. According to this model, the reduction of vegetation cover drives a reduction of rainfall by increasing solar radiation reflected by the soil surface known as albedo. The model implied a self-enforcing trend towards less rainfall and thus desertification. The 2 decades of drought from the 1970s to the 1990s further spread the desertification narrative to an international level. After previous failed attempts at grouping together to combat desertification with conferences and committees, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification internationally recognized desertification as a global problem in 1994. More scientific research in the 1980s started to contradict the ever-growing desertification narrative, such as new findings in desert ecology that Sahelian vegetation often bounced back after periods of drought, research showing the population density was not accelerating land degradation, as well as no evidence found to sustain the albedo theory. However, despite these new findings in research, the same desertification narrative from colonial times persisted. In the present, like in many regions, climate change is predicted to affect areas prone to desertification. Though this is typically depicted in the media as increasingly warmer and drier climate conditions and the expansion of the desert, rainfall in areas such as the Sahara and the Sahel is actually expected to increase. Thus, the narrative of desertification continues to thrive today, prevailing over scientific research as it has many times in the past. Overall, in combination with the failure to take into account scientific research, this narrative's success can also be attributed to it being a powerful political tool for controlling rural populations and knowledge. Those who play a role in the socially constructed narrative that has portrayed deserts as inhospitable wastelands use these areas to their advantage and benefit from the narrative being pushed and the climate that they blame natives for, and use these so-called wastelands for weapons testing and isolated prisons. Emery Rose summarized the influence of crisis narratives like this one well by stating, "These narratives are not fueled by evidence, but by the interests and power of the institutions defending and maintaining them, which is why this narrative is still so popular in society, politics, and the media today." Despite the setbacks in the spread of scientific research on desertification caused by the colonial narrative, desertification is now known to have both natural and anthropogenic causes. The term used for the natural processes such as erosion through wind and water, periods of drought, wildfires, and atmospheric circulation patterns of Hadley cells is known as desertization, whereas desertification refers to human-induced causes like deforestation and unsustainable agriculture. The United Nations have estimated that desertification rates have increased by 30 to 35%, largely attributed to these human activities, which is the factor driving many to look for solutions like the project known as the Great Green Wall Initiative.
Led by the African Union and 11 African countries, the Great Green Wall Initiative initially aimed to restore trees and vegetation across 8,000 kilometers of the Sahel region, stretching from Senegal on the west coast of Africa to Djibouti on the Red Sea in the east. The aspiration and design was simple: plant a green wall across the Sahara, and it would stop the southward expansion, improve soil quality, and provide food and resources for local communities. Other countries were supportive of building the Great Green Wall. More than 14 billion US dollars had been raised and pledged to support this game-changing initiative. France and Germany have also been supportive of the project. France pledged $14.3 billion to the project in 2021. However, some countries expressed concern for the wall because of its linear rainforests and jungles that are not meant to grow together. These countries thought that the project was destined to fail. Original issues. Originally, when creating the Great Green Wall, the local people were not consulted. They used Western planting techniques in Africa, which did not work because they were not using native farming techniques. There was not much funding or science that suggested it would work. Large portions of the wall were uninhabited, meaning no one would be there to care for the saplings, and they all died. In this image, it shows the original wall and how it was poorly constructed. Today, they use native farming techniques, which has led to greater results. To implement the Great Green Wall, they use biomass trenches. Inside the trenches, they have planting pits where they have planted fruit trees such as guava trees. These trenches are just the first step in the pilot. They will also be using other native species in the pits that will drive the rejuvenation of the soil. This will also protect the soil as the system starts growing into abundance while producing food and life for the people in Africa. In its mature state, this system will look like a forest. Forest lines will be producing biomass and fruit. In between the forest lines, there will be horticulture and vegetables. This is exactly the way nature works in Africa. The larger pits help to support the plants and vegetables. The shape of the biomass pit is called a half moon. This is an African farming technique that aims to preserve the little amount of rainfall each year. The water flows down and gets trapped in the half moon shape. The use of indigenous farming practices helps the Great Green Wall flourish. The Great Green Wall has had many successes. The most obvious success is the environmental success. The wall is taking harmful CO2 chemicals out of the air and providing food for the local people and shelter for the animals. The Great Green Wall provides an economic benefit because the farmers of the wall make a steady living. Many local people have been influenced to move closer to the wall in search of work. These people can then provide fruit and food for their families while also promoting sustainable agriculture. Another benefit is the social aspect. People have gathered around the Great Green Wall, providing a spot for people from all over to meet. Women are able to work farming the wall, promoting gender equality and combating women in poverty. And lastly, the Great Green Wall is a peace sign between African countries because they have to work together to ensure its success. Financial constraints. The Great Green Wall project is a massive project and a large investment. For the project is often hard to find and insufficient, which could lead to delays in work and completion. Political instability. The implementation of the Great Green Wall is complicated by the political instability. Each of the 11 countries has their own leadership. Some of the countries also suffer from political injustice. They have corrupt governments that take the money for the Great Green Wall for themselves. Lack of local involvement. The Great Green Wall project is often criticized for lack of local involvement of local communities in the planning and implementation of the project, which could lead to conflicts and a lack of ownership of the project by local communities. While funded by offshore countries, companies, and private donations, these people are not the ones actually taking care of the Great Green Wall. The locals are expected to care for the wall but have been left out of the major decisions, causing them to not care for the wall. Implementation challenges. The Great Green Wall project faces challenges in terms of technical implementation, such as selecting the appropriate tree species. Many of the current tree species are not native to Africa, meaning they are less likely to survive. All of these challenges make building the Great Green Wall slower. It is important to listen to the community and hear their thoughts about the project because they are the ones who live with the project every day. Here are some quotes from various stakeholders in the project. Sustainable Land Management Specialist and Senior Fellow at the World Resource Institute. If all the trees that had been planted in the Sahara since the early 1980s had survived, it would look like Amazonia. Inspiring youth from the Great Green Wall countries. The Great Green Wall will not be done in offices. It must be done by the communities where they live. Renowned singer and actress and UNCCD land ambassador. The people in the region have aspirations and dreams in the initiative, and it's not just a matter of survival, because to have only that wish would be terrible. It is true that the Great Green Wall is a vision by Africans for Africa, but it has now become a global movement because it will benefit everyone in the world. It is vital for communities to act and to get the support they need. In my view, the ambition is not unattainable, it can be achieved.
As we have learned, the Great Green Wall was not the solution for desertification. Instead, more local technologies and methods have been developed and utilized to make improvements on reclaiming the desert land. One technique that is successful in the Sahel is the use of zai pits. It is a traditional agricultural method used to grow crops in dry conditions. Essentially, small depressions are made in the soil and filled with compost to collect and store rainwater that can then be used to water crops or other plants. The zai technique is known as an efficient and sustainable way to grow crops in dry conditions. The zai technique works based on complex ecological mechanisms. When the pits get filled with rain, the compost releases nutrients that then attract termites. The termites dig into the degraded soil, allowing the water to follow and transform organic matter for the plant's benefit. Thanks to the termites and zai pits, seedlings can grow in a moist, fertile pocket. A downfall to the technique is that it requires high investments and lots of manual labor. Yakuba Sawadogo is a famous user of the zai technique. He uses the technique in his village in Burkina Faso to grow sorghum. He preps the zai pits by breaking through the crusted soil in a crisscross plot and then adds compost and seeds in preparation for the next rainfall. Using zai, Sawadogo has been able to reforest 27 hectares of desert land and has earned the nickname the man who stopped the desert and is recognized by the United Nations. Another technique that can be used to reverse desertification is demilunes. Similar to zai pits, half-moon holes are dug into desert land and a seed is planted in the middle of the half-moon. The demilunes then are able to catch and store rainwater, keeping the soil moist for the seed to grow. Demilunes have been used for years in Niger, and women in the Kanda village earn a weekly wage to practice the technique. Stone bunds are another possible answer to combat desertification. They focus on reducing soil erosion and rain runoff during intense rainfall. Stone bunds are essentially little walls built on natural contour lines to both reduce erosion in dry seasons and collect rainfall during wetter periods. Best results are achieved by combining these stone bunds with another agriculture technique such as zai pits so the water collected is properly utilized. Similar to zai pits, stone bunds are also expensive and labor intensive. When thinking of solutions for desertification, there are some important ideals to keep in mind. First, regenerative sustainability should be practiced. But why is regenerative sustainability so important? It is the process of finding solutions to climate issues that are not only sustainable but also add value back to the area it is being practiced on. Zai pits, for example, not only use the existing soil to grow crops, but it also adds aeration and nutrients to the arid land with the mix of compost and termites. That soil will now have better growing conditions for the next generation. Another important ideal to keep in mind is to use diverse local knowledge. Those who have been living in the area that is being worked on are used to the conditions and will have their own creative solutions. The Great Green Wall, which was made without local consultation, was a massive flop and shows the importance of truly knowing a place, not only the geography but the culture and identity that makes it unique. All of the solutions mentioned before were not created by those in developed countries. They are local and productive strategies for dealing with climate change in the Sahel. They are all examples of regenerative sustainability, and as the knowledge is spread in practice, they could cause real change in the area in which they are practiced. Desertification in the Sahel is a complex issue that requires communities to come together to fight as one, which is highly encouraged if they are able to use their own knowledge to work with their colleagues. Regenerative solutions make for a promising future where those in the Sahel can continue to live and revitalize the land that they have used for generations.